Welcome to the Whole Health Empowerment Project podcast. This show is for women over 40 who are trying to create balance in their life when it comes to food, body, self-care, and wellness. You struggle to put yourself first, to maintain consistency when something isn't perfect, or maybe you feel like you don't have enough time or willpower to achieve the goals you desire. I'm your host, Trisha Stefankowitz, registered dietitian, nutritionist. I've worked with women like you achieve their goals by focusing on the next best step, no matter how messy, and meeting you where you are right now. In this show, you'll learn practical information, actionable strategies, and mindset tweaks so that you can feel healthier, more comfortable in your body, and make choices that work for your life. Come join me in failing forward, one imperfect step at a time, into the journey of health, wellness, and self-care. Welcome to your new project. Hey ladies, welcome back to the show. On today's episode, we're going to talk about body composition, in particular subcutaneous fat, visceral fat, what happens to your muscles as you get older, and all of the things that the scale is not going to be able to show you and that BMI isn't going to be able to determine. So much of the time on here, we talk about things for a healthier life and this idea that you too can have it. And one of the things that I see a lot and I hear a lot is that people will be, and especially women, doing all of these things for their health. They're doing all these behaviors that if they can maintain that over the long term, they're going to get to where they want to be and they're going to improve their health and decrease their risk of disease. But what happens is so much of that is measured on if you're losing weight or not. And so then if you're doing all this work and you feel like you're not getting to the weight that you want, then a lot of times people want to stop. And so I want to talk about more than just weight and really kind of dive into these topics today so that you can stop focusing on weight and start to think about what your body is like in terms of your lean mass and the different fat that you hold in your body. That is, some of it is normal. So first, we're going to talk about subcutaneous fat because this is the fat, and I feel like fat in general gets like this bad connotation. We all have subcutaneous fat. It's typically that fat that's just under your skin that you can pinch. This kind of fat is typically stored in your hips and your thighs and your belly. How much of a subcutaneous fat really is related to many things, including your gender. If you're a woman, lucky us, we get to have more subcutaneous fat because we have this capacity to bear children if we choose to do so. One of the other things is genetics, also the kind and amount of food that you eat and how physically active you are. There are some health benefits to having subcutaneous fat. And one of the first things is that it acts as an energy storage. So when you eat food, your body utilizes what it needs, and what it doesn't need at that particular time, it stores as energy. So subcutaneous fat is where your body is going to tap into during periods where you're not eating as much and your body still needs energy in order for it to function at its most cellular level. So subcutaneous fat is a place that your body will be like, okay, great, I need that energy, let me dip in there. So that is one of the main functions. Another one that I don't think we think about often is protection. The subcutaneous fat helps protect our internal organs and also the muscles from having a lot of damage from physical impact. But it also helps with insulation as it helps the body maintain a normal body temperature. And then another really important function that it does is it's involved in the production of certain hormones, specifically metabolism, hunger, and appetite hormones. So we need to have subcutaneous fat in order to be involved in this hormone production. But there are health risks associated with having excess subcutaneous fat. And that usually tends to be, and what you hear of is obesity. And then having subcutaneous fat can contribute to obesity and then increase your risk of diseases such as insulin resistance, which may then go into diabetes, heart disease, and hypertension. Also, if you have a lot of excess weight that you're carrying around, it can strain your joints. And over time, that can lead to other conditions such as osteoarthritis. Then you have something else that I don't know that we've talked about on here, which is called your visceral fat. And that visceral fat is different from subcutaneous fat in that it is hidden in your surrounding organs. And it's not usually anything that you can see on the outside. Typically, visceral fat is seen on MRIs and CT scans. So it's not something that is utilized frequently. I feel like a lot of times where I see it is in obesity studies, and they're trying to figure out proportions of obesity in different individuals. And then you'll see like images of or MRIs of participants involved in those studies. So visceral fat is fat that can be really dangerous. And so that's why I wanted to kind of talk about this. Visceral fat, because it surrounds your organs and it's not seen from the outside, it ends up being located in your abdominal cavity and the organs in that area. So that can be your stomach, your liver, and your intestines. Also, it can build up in the arteries as well. One of the things about visceral fat is this concern for inflammation. And visceral fat is considered to be quote unquote active fat because it causes low grade inflammation. So if you have a lot of visceral fat, then there's concern that you have this low grade inflammation. And that low grade inflammation will be something that like essentially your body is in this inflammatory place. And that chronic inflammation can be a risk factor for other diseases. One thing we know about, or a few things we know about visceral fat, is that higher levels of visceral fat, again, fat surrounding your organs, are associated with an increased risk of heart disease and stroke. And it can contribute to insulin resistance and also type 2 diabetes. One of the other things that we know about visceral fat is that it's linked with breast and colon cancer and Alzheimer's disease. And probably sometimes since I've been a dietitian, also it has been linked with non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. So I remember when I was first studying to be a dietitian, when we would talk about liver disease, because this was many, many years ago, it would be based on like alcoholic cirrhosis. But over time, as there have been rising rates of obesity, there also has been higher rates of visceral fat, and in particular, excessive fat in the liver cells. And that is what causes non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. That can also progress to something called NASH. So you may hear people that have this, and it's typically related to visceral fat increase. One of the things that is really interesting about the subcutaneous and the visceral fat is we know that there's a diet and exercise component. So this isn't the interesting part though yet. The diet part we all know is probably related to excess calories, excess and increase in carbs, inactivity. One of the things besides having excess calories related to how active you are is that we also know that stress has a really big role in visceral fat and subcutaneous fat development as well. And why that is that for people who go through these prolonged periods of stress, what happens with stress is that stress causes cortisol production, and cortisol is an inflammatory response. So the more and more cortisol production you have, the more risk you are for subcutaneous and visceral fat development. So it's not just diet and exercise. We know that now it's probably also linked to stress, also linked to lack of sleep. We know that there are a ton of studies that talk about people who work the overnight shift have higher rates of obesity. And that is related to some of the different triggers and different changes in hormones related to that. But another thing that I think is interesting is that there is some thought that as you go into menopause or closer to menopause, that decrease in estrogen that happens with the process could possibly contribute to subcutaneous fat and visceral fat, which is why you may hear women say, like, all of a sudden I had a belly. But this is why it's really interesting, because it's not just diet and exercise, it's such a bigger picture. And if you're somebody who's not currently in menopause and maybe you're perimenopausal, you're going to start having these changes. So I want to present this to you as like, okay, this is what you're going to see or maybe experience as time goes by. Because I think, fortunately, we're now in a world where there is a little bit more research on perimenopause and menopause, where before I feel like women just kind of suffered through all of it and didn't really know what to do. And it was always focused on diet and exercise, when we know that the change in hormones itself, the increase in stress, and then those hormones produce, as well as lack of sleep, that they all kind of work together in a bigger picture. And it's not as simplified as maybe previously thought. We know that also, in addition to everyone having subcutaneous fat, that it's normal to have visceral fat, and it usually tends to be about 10% of your body fat. And where the disease risk comes from is when you have excess to what your body needs. So before we start talking about what to do about that to reduce your risk, I also want to talk about this muscle component of it too. So for all of us, especially if you're over 40, you're in a place where you're starting to lose muscle. And as you get closer to menopause, that's going to increase as well. And we know that for women, especially women over 65, they're at risk for continued loss of lean mass or muscle. And that's called sarcopenia. And so sarcopenia is essentially that there is a decrease in muscle mass, muscle strength, and muscle function. And so the goal for all of us, no matter what stage you are at, whether you're perimenopausal, menopausal, postmenopausal, is this idea that you want to increase your muscle mass, especially your skeletal muscle mass, because we know that ends up being protective against diseases. It increases strength and function of the muscles, and it has been associated with an increase in longevity, as opposed to lack of muscle mass, which over time has been associated with increased mortality from falls as women get older and older. And so the goal is to not focus so much on your weight, but to focus on increasing your muscle and decreasing your subcutaneous and visceral fat. So you want to have subcutaneous fat, but it's trying to have the proportion that you can have the strength that you can continue to work on as you get older, and you're more at risk for losing that, but also getting to a point that you're not able, that you can hopefully slow down the amount of subcutaneous and visceral fat that you're making. Now, one of the ways to start to really figure out how much subcutaneous or visceral fat that you have are more like recently in the different gyms that are around. People will do these different studies that they have where you can essentially get into like a body comp scan. And these are usually offered in gyms where they measure your body fat and your muscle fat. But I don't know the validity and the accuracy of each machine. So if that is something that you wanted to do because you're trying to figure out, like, do you need to do more strength training and increase your muscle mass, I would use that, if you do it, as a benchmark. And then what I would do is, at the very beginning, I wouldn't compare yourself to other women. I would compare yourself to where you are right now. And then perhaps in like 6 months and then also in a year, you do the work in between, you do more strength training and do some cardiovascular exercises and maybe make some changes in your lifestyle, including the different, we'll talk about that, but the sleep changes and the stress level changes and what you're eating. And then you redo that machine and see where you shake out. Because hopefully that's where you're really going to start to see, like, you'll see the little things along the way. Like if you start to get stronger, that's probably one of the easier things. But the bigger thing is that you over time have this change in your composition to where you're favoring that you're reserving and conserving your strength. The other thing that you can do is they also have these BIA, like bioelectrical impedance. And that is another thing where you're just basically setting a benchmark and then you're tracking it over time because every machine is different. One of the ones that is more the gold standard is actually having an MRI machine, but it's really expensive and it's not practical for most people. So I would suspect unless you're in a study, that's probably not going to happen. But you can also do a DEXA scan. And most people think that a DEXA scan is really determined to determine osteoporosis. But DEXA scans are also used to measure body composition and what your fat distribution looks like. So there are some of the things that you're going to see that are out there on the market, but a really easy way to start to figure out what your subcutaneous fat is to measure your waist circumference. So that tends to be the smallest part of your waist. And if your waist is in a place where you're not really having a smaller part, to then hold a tape measure up to your belly button and essentially just wrap it around your tummy where your belly button is, where the line is going to be for you. And what happens is if you look on your tape measure and you see for a woman you're 35 or more, or a man 40 or more inches, especially women, 35 or more inches for women on that tape measure, it means that you're at a higher risk for visceral fat and diseases related to visceral fat. But waist circumference enough, I feel, doesn't really give enough information because women are all shaped in different ways. You could be shaped as an apple or a pear or anywhere in between. And so if you're just measuring your waist, it might not take that into account. So another way to do it, which is probably going to give you more data, and again, the waist circumference, and then the next one, the waist to hip circumference, that's probably something that is more accessible to most people. And so with the waist to hip circumference, you would measure your waist the same way as you would for the waist circumference. Usually measure your waist at its smallest point or right at the belly button. And then you would find what your hip circumference is by putting that tape measure around the widest part of your hips or your buttocks. And so essentially you're going to get a measurement for your hips and a measurement for your waist. And what you would then do is divide your waist by your hip circumference. And that is your waist to hip ratio. So divide your waist circumference by your hip circumference. And then you get a number. And if you have a waist to hip ratio above 0.85 for women, 0.85, and 0.90 for men, that indicates that you have abdominal obesity. Now, you could say, oh, do I really need to do that? I can look at my abdomen and I can see. I don't know. I think it's just probably a quick and easy measure. And again, that's something that you can redo over time. Like you could figure out what your markings were and where you measured before and keep it consistent, and then do the work in terms of whatever it is you're working on to get to your goal, and then remeasure in 3 and 6 and 9 and 12 months. Because hopefully that is a way that you can really start to see the changes over time rather than checking your weight in 3 months and it's being the same, and checking your weight in 6 months and it being the same. The goal would be that if you're doing all of these behavior changes, that you start to see these small changes in your waist and your hip circumference. So now that we've talked about all these things and you're getting at your tape measure and you're like, oh my gosh, having a heart attack, what your waist is or your waist to hip circumference is, let's talk about strategies that can improve these things, that can improve your body composition, and that is going to really have a big impact in your overall metabolic health, and that can have a really big impact in reducing your risk of disease. The first thing I would say would be to look at what you're eating. There are a million different things that a million different people do, and that is all going to depend on your past medical history, your age, how active you are, all of those things. But I think we all know that there are some things that really everyone should be eating to give your body what it needs. And the first thing I would say is to make sure that you're eating your lean proteins. Protein is such a buzzword now, everyone talks about it, but making sure that you have protein with each meal. The lean proteins are going to typically have less saturated fat and aid in giving you what your body needs, and it'll give you more protein. The lean proteins will give you what your body needs without having the addition of the saturated fat on it. That can be however you want it to be, but lean proteins like beans, like if you're doing plant-based proteins, it's probably not going to have as much protein as you're eating something like 3 or 4 ounces of chicken or turkey, which is probably going to give you more protein. The other things that I would say to eat is to focus on whole grains. So whole grains are your whole wheat products, because that's where you're going to get your fiber. And a lot of people forget about fiber, but we know fiber is really important for probably gut health as more and more research comes out about it. We know it's important to maintain bowel regularity, and it's also important for bowel health. And so fiber is one of those things that most people are not eating enough of. And so if you're not eating a lot of whole grains, then it's probably hard to get the goal fiber that you need. Also, make sure you're eating veggies most meals, and I would say fruit too. So most people, if they're in a place that they're like reducing their fruit intake, you can have some fruit, but obviously it's going to depend on what your other disease states that you're looking at and how you're managing that. But those are the staples. Have your lean, you need, all your macronutrients are lean proteins, are whole grains, and then also having your healthy fats. You need all of them. They're your macronutrients. And healthy fats are going to be the same way. Having avocados, having nuts, but watching your portion sizes, having olive oil. All of those things in terms of fat are going to be way better than trans fats and excessive saturated fat. So focusing on lean proteins, whole grains, having your healthy fats as your macronutrients, and then getting some of the micronutrients you need by having fruits and veggies will help you, again, varied according to your age, your weight, your everything, like your past medical history. There's just so many variables there, but that's kind of like the crux of the things that are the most important. And then when it comes to diet, like really watching what you're taking in terms of your refined carbs. You need to probably limit some of the sugary foods that you're eating and beverages. This, to me, is usually like your sodas and your fruit juices, but it can also be your refined carbohydrates. So it's going to be like all of the delicious snack food items like chips and pretzels and whatever other thing that you love. You can have them, but I would say that you want to watch how much you have of those things. And these are the things that I would say, like, you don't want to have it every meal, you want to have it sometimes. And that also is included with the healthy fats and the non-healthy fats. All of those are way more caloric, so you want to watch your portion size of the healthy fats and then try to avoid the things that aren't going to give you that are going to reduce your risk of disease, like your saturated fats and trans fats. Next, I would say, let's talk about exercise. This is going to be a really big one. So engaging in regular physical activity, and that is going to help you burn calories and reduce fat. And then also talking about strength training. So at this point for women, you probably should be incorporating some kind of strength training to build muscle, and that muscle will help increase metabolism and help you burn fat more effectively. But also, this is what's going to help us in terms of changing our body composition. And in terms of cardiovascular exercise, walking is something that I think when we really talk about this idea of changing your body composition, that is so helpful because it's free. Most people can do it. It is able to help with sleep. And one of the really big things is it helps manage stress. And remember, stress is one of the things that can increase and put your body into more of a state of inflammation. And so having this regular physical activity, which can help manage your stress, help you sleep better, all of that really helps. And I think walking is one of the most undervalued exercises that really help with that. So getting some cardiovascular exercise and also strength training to help with changing your body composition and decreasing your subcutaneous and visceral fat. We talked about sleep, and so making sure that you're getting 7 to 9 hours of quality sleep, because if you're not sleeping great or you're having less sleep than your body needs, you're going to disrupt your hormone levels, and that disruption can lead to and contribute to overall weight gain. And then also practicing stress management. So trying to find ways that you're able to take time for yourself, whether that is meditation or yoga or deep breathing or walking, whatever stress management or journaling, whatever that looks like to you. We know that chronic stress can lead to fat accumulation, particularly visceral fat. So if you're able to really start to manage this stress, especially if it's chronic, well, that's going to really help you reduce your visceral fat in your body so that when you do a waist to hip circumference ratio, hopefully you'll see a difference in your body composition. And then I would say having regular checkups to measure your cholesterol and different things, all of the things that are going to tell you information about your metabolic health. So that tends to be like your blood sugar, your hemoglobin A1C, your cholesterol, and then kind of get into, they have so many studies now that talk about cardiovascular disease risk. And so it probably wouldn't hurt to know that too. Because again, these are going to be way more effective ways to really see what your health is than just a weight and a BMI. If you're able to figure out what your waist to hip circumference is and see how that improves over time, that's what's really going to help you get to where you want to be. And the same thing with your numbers. If you're able to change your numbers so that they are able to be normal, that too is going to show you where you are in terms of your metabolic health. So all of this to say that it's really important to know what the health implications are with having subcutaneous fat, having increased risk of visceral fat, and then also the benefit of having pretty good muscle mass. By adopting a healthy diet, engaging in regular physical activity, making these lifestyle changes with including more sleep and less stress, you're really going to be able to manage your metabolic health and also reduce your risk of the diseases that are going to be a part of weight gain, and more importantly, the diseases associated with an increased risk of visceral fat. And so, I think you need to then try to figure out today, I would say one thing that you can do is take a tape measure out and figure out what your waist circumference is, and then go and do your hip circumference, your widest part of your hips, and divide your waist by your hip and try to figure out what that ratio is. And if it's greater than 0.85, then we're trying to figure out, okay, like what can you do? What does it look like for you? What are some of the things that you think you need to work on so that you can get to a place that you're able to achieve your goal? If you're someone over 40, I have a freebie in the show notes that you can grab. And that also talks about some other things that you can do to help with this. And I think even if you're not able to do a lot of the changes at this particular time, even starting with a walk, and it doesn't matter how long it is, it's just that you're doing something, because doing a walk is going to kill two birds here. It's going to be able to help you get that cardiovascular exercise in, and it's also going to help you manage stress, which will hopefully decrease your visceral fat risk. And then hopefully it's going to allow you to sleep better so that you're able to get, by that one walk, a couple of things that you're able to help in terms of changing your body composition. So if you have any questions, or if there is anything that you want me to talk about, please go on over to the show notes and you can find my information there. You can also find me on Instagram at Whole Health Empower. And thank you so much for listening. I really do appreciate all your feedback, and I appreciate all your support. So thanks so much, and I will see you guys back here next week. Thanks so much for listening to this episode. If you found value in this podcast, please rate, review, or subscribe on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Don't forget to share this episode with your friends. Together, we can take tiny, imperfect steps towards creating the whole health we desire and deserve. Don't forget to grab your freebie. You can find the link in your show notes or over at triciard.com. I'll see you back here next week.